Hello and welcome to Console Cowboys. So let's talk about the kickoff call process. So there's a lot to this process. It's not just simply hopping on a call. There's things you got to do before this call. There's questions you got to ask during that call, issues you got to deal with, as well as things you want to do after this call. So prior to hopping on the call, you want to have a discussion with whoever scoped this target. You want to get all the information from them that you can so you can ask intelligent questions once you got on the call. You also want to determine what information gaps there are that you need so that you can acquire those. Now, this might require you to get the information prior to the call or may be beneficial to do that. So you might want to write up a document that asks all the questions you need to ask intelligent questions when you get on the call, whether that's the URL and credentials so you can verify those before you hop on the call to make sure you're good to go, or whether that's the IP addresses so you can determine, is this internal or is this external? Did they give me proper IP addresses? Also, is there blocking technologies in place that I need to deal with and I can have those discussions with the client, such as a web application firewall or an IDS IPS. You also want to know if it's an application, what the user roles are, how many there are, so you can have the discussion on what those are and the use cases. So that way you can really get as much information during the call as possible, asking intelligent questions rather than questions that you could have, just had them fill out prior to the call. Now, once you hop on this call, there are things you got to understand. You got to understand their environment. You got to understand why they're doing the test. You got to understand the application or the network that you're hacking. You need to find out all the things that you need to get your job done. The environment, let's talk about that. Are you in a QA environment? Are you in a staging environment? Are you in a production environment? Because that changes things. For example, if you're in a production environment, there might be a lot of sensitive data that maybe you shouldn't enumerate 50,000 records. If you break into something, maybe you should just verify one record, leave it at that, desensitize the data for the report and say I found something, versus maybe you're going to do a little more enumeration in a staging environment to show some other kind of impact, right? So what environment are you in, as well as how much automation do you want to do? If you're in a production environment, you may not want to do as much automation and things that could take things down, versus if you're in a staging environment, you might be able to just go at it pretty hard and not worry about taking anything down. So these are things you want to understand with that environment. You also want to understand, do I need additional access? Is this internal? Is this an internal application or an internal network pen test where I need to have a machine on their network or I need to have VPN access? If so, what are those credentials? How do I access that? You want to find out all these things on this call so you can follow up later on in order to make sure you have access prior to testing. With all the access stuff out of the way, you have to think about blocking technologies. Do they have a web application firewall in place? Do they have an IDS in place? And why do they have those in place while you're testing? Is it because they are PCI and they don't want you to find anything and they just want to put up their defenses and have you get blocked? Or do they not understand the difference between testing a web application firewall versus the actual application? And is that a conversation where you need to educate them that you're here to find all the vulnerability in the user, coded code that might have a lot of issues, versus testing their industry standard web application firewall? Because your job is to find the vulnerabilities in the application. So if that firewall fails or there's an attacker that goes slower and has lots of time and they can bypass that web application firewall, they don't find something really bad you couldn't find in the 1 week that you tested. You need to talk to the client, figure out what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, and then educate them to the best of your ability on what you should do for that process. So with that out of the way and the discussion of figuring out, do they whitelist you for the web application firewall? Do they not? What network you're on? Now you have to start thinking about, why are they having this test? The why of a penetration test is actually very important. So it could be as simple as we have to get a test because of PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance, in which case they're more concerned with specific vulnerabilities that make them not compliant where they're going to get fines. Or it may be that they created new functionality which integrates with old functionality, and they're really concerned with you diving into the new functionality and how it interacts with the application or how it interacts with the network, and finding vulnerabilities specific to that with new things that were opened up based on a new code base. Or it could be a network penetration test, and they're really concerned with you getting a hold of confidential data. So your job may be, once you break in, to find this data. This data might be supposedly segmented off or protected with encryption, etc. And your job is to find a place where you can get a hold of this data that is not so protected or bypass the security controls to get at it where they think it is. So it's really important to understand why you're testing. Otherwise, you can't actually, do a proper scenario for them to make them happy with why they acquired the penetration test in the first place. Now, once you figure out the why, now we need to talk about, what does it do? What I mean by that is, if you're testing, for example, a web application, what is the application used for? What types of users are using this application, and what are these user workflows? These are questions you want to ask the client, because you have the ability to ask the people who created it how it's used, in what way it's used, what type of users use it, what are the functionality, and how everything interacts together. Because if you understand this information, you know where it can break down and you know what to target. If I don't know specific functionality exists and it's not apparent looking at the app, but I can get all this information on how it's used from the client, I can ask more intelligent questions to dig deeper, which helps me attack the application and formulate a plan for attack during the testing phase. And if this is a network, am I on an industrial control system network where there's a lot of defaults or things that can go down? Am I in some kind of user segment where there's all kinds of Microsoft protocols and users passing things back and forth and potential weak passwords? Or, is this some kind of cloud environment? Or does it speak to a cloud environment where I need to understand, is on-premise in scope versus the cloud stuff in scope, etc.? Because I need to understand where the boundaries are. I need to understand what I'm dealing with in order to properly test it, because I can't go testing cloud components if they're out of scope. I can't go attacking users and social engineering if that's out of scope. And I shouldn't start throwing, the kitchen sink at an industrial control system, because it might break and then a nuclear power plant blows up. So what does it actually do? Are we controlling the electric on the northern hemisphere? Or, is it just a user segment? Or is there an application, and what is that functionality? This is your, opportunity to really understand what it does. That way you can make proper decisions as to how to attack it. So that's a big component of these kickoff call meetings. You need to ask all these questions and find out what you're attacking so you can formulate attack plans, and you can ask further questions to know where to attack. Depending on the answers of the client at this point, you may also want to ask for a walkthrough. If it's a really, really complicated application where there's menus upon menus and user roles integrated everywhere, and it's really hard to work through a workflow of the application when they start trying to explain it to you, you may want to set up an additional call after the fact where they walk through the different user roles that you're testing and how a user would go through their day-to-day processes, because that will really, really be beneficial for you in order to understand how the application functions. Otherwise, you might be kind of lost in there trying to figure out something that took a user, 2 years to figure out that a functionality existed. So having those users walk you through that and getting those people on the call, you're going to get the fast track and actually be able to fully test this application as a person with insider knowledge, which really helps you protect that application by finding all the vulnerabilities. So that's something to think about. Now, the next thing is you need to get a hold of all the items at this point that you need to test, right? Do you already have that URL from that, prior to call document? Do you have the IP addresses? Do you have the credentials? Did you validate them? Did you run into issues when you were validating them? So let's say that they filled out all the documentation and you tested it and the URL doesn't come up. So at this point, you need to find out, okay, is this URL not spun up yet, but it's going to? Or do I need to be having my whitelisted IP address? Do I need access to your internal environment, and how do I do that, right? So I might need to submit my IP address to their IT department to get it whitelisted to see this application, or I may need VPN credentials to get into their network to test this application and or network. So you need to make sure that prior to this call, you can validate as much as possible so that when you're on the call, you can ask the proper questions to make sure that you're going to have access either during that call if there's had time, or prior to testing, you're able to validate again and make sure you have access to all the things you're going to ask for. So you're going to make sure if it's an application, you have the URL and that you can get to that URL, that you can log in with the proper user roles that you're testing. Then if it's a network, do I have the IP addresses? If it says it's an external test, are these external IP addresses? If they say it's an internal test, are these internal IP addresses? If I need access because it's an internal network, do I have VPN credentials already, and do they work, and have I tested them prior to this call? So like I said, it's not just hopping on the call, it's making sure that you have everything you need to succeed in the testing phase. So prior to that call, you're going to try these out, and the things that didn't work, you're going to ask for during this call, and then you're going to try them on the call or after the call and get back to them. You may need to set up another meeting later on to verify things, right? So do you have all the things that you need? Now let's talk about the issues that are going to pop up, that always pop up during kickoff calls, if there's going to be an issue. The first one we already talked about, which was the whitelisting issue, right? Not wanting to whitelist you because they want to, have their protection mechanisms in place. We already talked about that. So we'll move on to the next big one, which is I want you to act like a hacker, and we're not going to provide you any information. So you might have sent the client your pre-kickoff call meeting document, you got it back, and pretty much nothing is filled out. You hop up on the call to figure out what's going on there, and they tell you, well, you're a hacker, I don't need to give you this information. Now, this could be valid, this might not be valid. It might be an education point where you can educate them, or maybe it's completely valid. Maybe they've tested everything extensively and now they want to find out what their external footprint is. But these are the questions you got to ask. You need to find out why they want it done like that, what they've done prior, because they need to understand that if you spend, say, a week doing reconnaissance, that's going to cut into their testing time. And if they only have a week and a half or 2 weeks to do testing, half the time to find vulnerabilities is gone based on something they could have provided you up front. Now, this might be what they wanted because they might want to find out what is our external footprint when somebody's looking us up. What do they see versus what do they don't see? So that way they can figure out, how to better segment things, hide things, etc., whatever they're trying to achieve. But you need to also educate them that this is eating directly into their time of finding vulnerabilities. So if you waste 7 of 10 days doing enumeration and you only actually test for 3 days, a lot of actual vulnerabilities on external applications and external network components may be missed because an attacker has unlimited time. So unless they really are curious about what an attacker sees, they should provide this all up front so that way you can spend most of your time making sure they're secure, not cataloging stuff that they already have. However, again, it may be totally valid. Maybe they actually want to test their incident response for you doing enumeration of things, or they want to test the user data that's out there and how many usernames you can get, how many network and subdomains you can find, like what's actually available out there so they can, have a better idea of their network presence. This might actually be your test as well. It could just be an open source intelligence gathering test. We need to understand what test you're doing, what the original scope was, and then educate the client on the pros and cons of everything so they can make an educated decision as to what to do. Now, this gets a little more tricky when you start talking about web applications. So every once in a while, you're going to have a web application test, and you're going to get a client that doesn't want to give you URLs. doesn't want to give you credentials, doesn't want to give you any information about anything yet. Your scope says that you have, one URL and 5 user roles, etc., and they give you nothing. Now, this is definitely an education point at this point. So you can explain to them that if you get nothing but a URL and there's nothing but a authentication prompt, and it's a 10-day web application, if you can't bypass authentication and you can't find authentication issues, or you can't provision your own username for this test, then they're not going to have a valuable test, because you can't actually test everything in the application, especially you can't test all these user roles, right? So what you might want to do is then educate them. How about we spend 2 days of this 10 days prior to authentication, and I'm going to try to bypass everything. I'm going to try to break into everything, but if we can't get anywhere after those 2 days, you're going to provide me all the user roles and explain to me what they are, so I can do a proper test and get as much value for you as possible. Yet you still get this external perspective of this black hat hacker that you can, talk about how we couldn't get anywhere with it, right? Or maybe you do get somewhere with it, and once you actually break in, you can continue down that path until you can't get anywhere there, and then they're going to provide you more information so you can provide them more value. But you need to explain the pros and cons to them, because if they don't understand that you're not going to give them value if you can't get anywhere, then they're going to be very mad when they get hacked in the future by an internal person who already has a username and password and left the company that they didn't then cancel, and they break into everything with vulnerabilities that you couldn't even see those vulnerabilities because you couldn't test them to begin with. Or if you got an attacker with a lot of time in their hands and maybe they get lucky and they guess some user credentials, then that attacker has a lot more ability to break into things that were never tested and might get a hold of sensitive data or take them down, etc. So this is an education point, and a big part of these kickoff calls. If you have a client who's not as mature, they haven't had penetration tests, your job is to educate them on the penetration testing process, educate them on how to get the most value out of their penetration test, educate them on how things work, the difference between, testing a web application firewall versus testing the application, testing as a hacker versus testing as a person who knows some stuff or a person who's an insider, etc., and where to get that value and where those points are of, when I should test like this and when I should test like that. These are all very, very important. So it's a very big education point. Now, the last thing I'll talk about here is changing the scope. So sometimes you'll get the scope and it's one web application, or it's 50 IP addresses on the external, and you hop into the kickoff call. And then all of a sudden they're handing you 10 web applications and they're handing you all these credentials. You need to step them back and you need them to understand that based on the scope that was provided, you have enough time to test this one web application and maybe dive into other components that it talks to, but you don't have time to test 50 applications and they need to go back and rescope it. Or if you had 3 days and they had 50 IP addresses and they upped this to 500 IP addresses, or even a Class B network that you can't even have an Nmap scan finish in that time frame, you really can't test anything because you might not even have a scan back in that time. So this is the other big thing that comes up, is change of scope at that point, and it's a hard conversation to have, but you need them to stick to the plan at that point, or they need to get a change order and figure out, a bigger scope and figure out where to go from there, and then come back to this kickoff call once everything's in order. So once all of this is done, and if you have any lingering items, you need to write all of these down and send out an email at the end of this call to the client with all of the line items they're supposed to be doing. If they're supposed to be getting you VPN credentials or URLs or IP addresses, or if you're supposed to schedule another call to do a walkthrough or to validate access, this is the time that you do that right after the call. You send them that checklist items and then you follow up with them later. And we'll talk about that in the next video on just making sure you have everything before you start testing. So hopefully this video was informative and really gets your mindset around all the things that you need to deal with on the kickoff call. It's not just a call with the client to, verify information you already have. There's a lot of components to it, and hopefully this video was useful to you.